everyone, I'm Miss Lydia from the Boston Library. Thank you so much for joining me for our craft project today. Today our project is making paper mache lanterns. So there are a lot of different techniques that you can use to do this. What I'm going to use as my base are some balloons. So I've blown up 4 balloons. You can make as many as you want to a kind of a small size. I want to work with a smaller balloon so that my lantern ends up, it's going to come up about halfway up the balloon. So if you can visualize that size, that's what I'm going to end up with here. So I have my balloons, I have regular printer paper, which is going to act as my base, tissue paper, I have some plant material here too. So you can press these for as long as you want. I picked some leaves and some flowers, just put them between 2 pieces of parchment paper and then set some heavy books on them. I only did it for a few hours, and that's basically just to flatten them out, make it a little bit easier to work with. You can do it for up to a week. If you fully dry them, they do start to get brittle and they'll be a little harder to work with if you're trying to bend them around a curved surface. And then to make my paper mache, I have flour, water, and salt. So I have shredded my paper, my printer paper and my tissue paper here. So I have a lot of that shredded. I have my pressed, semi-dried leaves here, so some sage leaves, some hydrangea flowers, geranium, and ferns that I'm going to use. And I have a cup of flour here that I'm going to mix with a cup of water. And then I'm going to also put in 2 teaspoons of salt. I'm going to dump all that water in there. I'm going to add my salt. And once that's done, I'm just going to make sure I stir it up really carefully. And that's going to be my paper mache. If it's too thick, you can thin it out with a little bit more water. There's a lot of different recipes and different proportions for this. Basically, we're just trying to make a really sticky paste that's going to make all of our paper stick to the balloon. The other thing that I've done to make this a little bit easier is that I have tied some string onto the end of my balloons. So once I have the paper mache base built, I'm going to hang these to dry. So by tying the string ahead of time, it helps me in the end. Once I have a big sticky mess on the end here, I can just hang it and let it dry without touching anything. So once I have that all stirred up, try to get as many of the lumps out. We're going to start with our printer paper. So I have ripped this into about 1-inch strips. You don't have to be too particular with it. You can see they're all a little bit different shape. What you're going to do is, and this does get messy, so you want to have some paper towels and things on hand, feed that through your paper mache, and you can use your fingers to kind of squish off the excess. You're going to take your balloon and you're going to start working around the base. Now remember not to go all the way up, so you have to kind of visualize where your edge is going to be. If you think about the curve of a lantern, it can come up to about here, but if you go all the way up the top, you're not going to be able to get your candle in. So I'm just going to keep working that way. It does get a little bit hard. Sometimes if you can get them to sit into a glass or a bowl and then work over your top that way, you're just going to keep feeding and placing more of this paper over top. So you're going to build a full base of the printer paper. What you want to make sure is that you don't get too many layers of the printer paper, because the more layers of the thicker paper you get, the less see-through your lantern's going to be. You want to switch to the tissue paper after you've got that first layer down. That's just to provide some strength. I finished my layer of printer paper, and you can see there are still some spots of the green peeking through. That's okay, because we're going to add more layers. Again, the printer paper layer is more for strength than it is for the aesthetic. It does start to get pretty heavy pretty quickly, so it starts to get a little hard to balance. I've gone through and I've tried to smooth out as many of the bumps in the paper mache as I can, but you can see I have a pretty solid layer of the paper mache on top. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to take my tissue paper and I'm going to start laying it down right over top of that, and then I'll brush another layer of paper mache over top. So I'm going to take the tissue paper and try to add another layer, and then you can just keep adding layers until you get the look that you're going for. Remember, the more layers that you add in, the less transparent it becomes. So I'm going to start by covering up all of my green spots and going through there. And sticking all of those down. Now, at any of these layers, you can start adding in your flowers. The closer to the top that you add them, obviously the more noticeable they'll be. So if you want them to be subtle, you can start adding them in probably after the first layer of tissue paper. If you want them to be right on top, you're going to add those at the very end, and we're going to use Mod Podge to put those on at the end. So I'm just going through, continuing to put my tissue paper down and building layers from there. You don't have to worry too much about the top edge. So right now it's rather uneven. It'll be easy to trim once this is all dry and hardened. And once we pop our balloon, then you can go through and trim up that edge, straighten it out. It is a little hard to balance here. Once I have a layer of tissue paper on, in order to continue building, one of the easiest ways to do it is to just take a cheap paintbrush, brush another layer, you can hold your balloon steady, brush another layer of that paper mache mix over the top, and then just keep adding more tissue paper. I've done several layers of the tissue paper at this point, and I continue to smooth the paper mache mix over the top. And now what I've decided to do is, with this one, I'm going to take some of my ferns and I'm actually going to kind of put them in between layers of tissue paper. So my paper mache is still wet. I'm going to kind of place my fern, and I'm going to go around and try to visualize it like it's hanging and figure out where you want those leaves to go. And you can just kind of press those down. If they're not where you want, the nice thing about this is you can just pick it back up and move it. So I'm going to go all the way around this. And it can be fairly freeform, again, thinking about kind of that natural look. See, I'm just adding more in. So I can kind of visualize what that might look like once this is finished now. I'm also going to stick some of my hydrangea blossoms in. So those may or may not show up very well. I'm not sure exactly how the transparency will end up with this because they are white, but I'm just going to stick those down the same way and kind of add those in between the ferns. So I know those may not show up real well on the camera. I'm hoping that once I have a candle in here, because of the difference in the density, you'll see the outline of the flower. So I'm just sticking those into the spaces between the ferns. Now, the next part of this is to take some more of your tissue paper and continue to go over a little bit. So you can use your fingers or you can use the paintbrush. Go add some paper mache over top of your leaves or your flowers, gently. And once you have an area covered with that mixture, you're going to take your tissue paper again, place it right over, and push it down. And so you can already see with just a single layer of tissue paper, you're still going to see a lot of that fern coming through. It just gives it a little bit more coverage over top of it, also protects the plant. So I'm going to continue doing that, and then I'm going to hang this one up to dry. I finished putting the next layer of tissue paper over top of the ferns and flowers and finished that off with another layer of my flower and water mix. So at this point, it's pretty heavy. It's also looks fairly solid, but still you can see a little bit of that green underneath just because we do want it to be transparent. So at this point, I feel like I'm pretty well done with this one. I'm going to go ahead and hang it and let it dry overnight. I've had these drying for close to 24 hours now. They are still a tiny bit damp, but that does give you a little bit of flexibility. So if you actually pop your balloon before it's completely dry, you can decide whether you want it to hang and have a completely rounded bottom, or if you want it to sit as a bowl, if it's still a tiny bit damp, when you take it off, you can just kind of press the bottom flat and then it will rest on a table or wherever you want to put it. So with this one, I punched some holes in the sides and then tied my twine around it. This one I have not coated. You could add a layer or two of Mod Podge, both on the inside and the outside, just to smooth out the edges, give it another layer of protection, or you could add a little bit of a gloss finish to it too. So to show you how this is gonna pop, I saved this one. So the easiest way, you don't want to pop it very violently because you might break it. So the easiest way is to hold your stem and to go in a little bit right there and just let it pop like that. And then it will just kind of shrink up in the middle and you can gently pull it away. And then you're left with that. So you can see I have those rougher edges around the top. I'm just going to take my scissors and trim them up just a little bit. Now, of course, these are made out of paper, so you don't want to be putting actual candles in these. The best thing to use, I mean, you can use these for anything. You don't have to use them as candle holders, but if you want to have a light inside, you can buy these cheap little tea lights that are battery operated, and once you put those inside, of course, it's not dark in here, so you're not going to get the full effect, but that's not going to generate any heat, so it's safe to put in there. And you can see, you can kind of go around and continue to trim up your edge, or you could use like scalloped scissors if you wanted to make a more decorative edge. So you can see how that one turns out. This one I am just going to hang, so I'm not going to flatten out the bottom. So if I don't flatten out the bottom, you see it's not going to sit. But I am going to go figure out where I want to punch my holes and make sure that they're down far enough that they're not going to rip through, and go directly across and punch another hole, and then you can take your twine and end up with your hanging lantern. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope you enjoyed this project, and we'll see you next week for another.